Imagine a world where some countries either can't or won't buy aircraft parts from other countries. No imported engines, no complex electronics, no titanium, no high-grade composites. Just one country trying to build an entire commercial jetliner all by itself. Now, imagine that country also trying to make its homegrown jet competitive with the likes of an Airbus A320neo or a Boeing 737 MAX. Spoiler alert, it won't go very well. In today's video, we're taking a deep dive into what really happens when a country tries to go at it alone in commercial aviation. We'll look at Russia's post-sanction struggles with aircraft like the SSJ-100 and the MC-21, and we'll look at China's long and still incomplete journey with the COMAC C919, and we'll ask the really big question. What does it look like to go at it alone, and what does it look like when you put cooperation first? Let me begin by setting the stage a bit. After Russia massively escalated their war on Ukraine in 2022, they soon found themselves cut off from much of the Western aerospace supply chain by punishing sanctions. Almost overnight, Russia lost its access to vital imports, everything from avionics made by Honeywell and Collins to CFM56 engine parts, maintenance manuals, and even machining tools for the titanium that they themselves were producing. On top of that, even spare parts for the Russian Airlines Airbuses and Boeing fleets became impossible to obtain. Well, at least legally. Now, we've talked before about what these sanctions have done to the Russian aviation industry, with planes forced to rely on counterfeit and sometimes even smuggled parts. And also how those sanctions have then made these Russian-held planes into as valuable as paperweights if their owners would ever want to sell them outside of Russia. So these sanctions then kicked off what the Russian government called the Russification of its aviation industry, and the goal was pretty simple. Replace foreign-made components with domestic alternatives. And the execution? Not so simple. Russian companies have attempted to produce their own modern home-built planes for decades now, and the results have been, well, let's be nice and say mixed. The Sukhoi Superjet 100 was the first test of this philosophy, and this was supposed to be Russia's answer to the Embraer E-Jet family, and it is quite a modern airliner, with advanced fly-by-wire systems, composite construction, as well as modern high-bypass turbofan engines. They've since said that they're now starting over with a second generation, which they will just call the SJ-100, with the key difference that this aircraft will rely entirely on local components. The original SSJ-100, for example, used the Franco-Russian SAM-146 engine, by a joint venture between Safran in France and UEC Saturn in Russia. Sanctions, though, quickly made that engine effectively unavailable. So instead, Russia designed a locally built replacement engine for the SSJ called the Aviation PD-8, by basically shrinking down and derating another engine that they already had called the PD-14. Now, both the PD-14 and the PD-8 aren't really new designs. They're instead updated versions of Aviad Vigatel's PS-90, which is an engine that first flew back in the mid-1980s, and I'll get back to these engines a bit later. Anyway, the development of the PD-8 for the Russified SSJ has so far been plagued by delays. The first example flew under the wing of an Ilyushin IL-76 back in 2022, but an actual Superjet didn't fly with these engines until March of this year, 2025. And the engine's certification is still to come. There are few details available for this engine, but what we do know doesn't look very promising. We don't know its exact bypass ratio, for example, but even the larger PD-14's bypass ratio is only 8.5 to 1, and since the PD-8 is a shrink-down version of that, its bypass ratio will definitely be even less. An engine's bypass ratio is basically the ratio between how much air is being pushed back by its fan, bypassing the engine core, and how much of that air that actually goes through the core. And you want that ratio to be as high as possible to increase the engine's overall performance. Now, even that 8.5 to 1 ratio of the PD-14 is a significant step down from the 10 or even 12.5 to 1 bypass ratios that Pratt & Whitney and CFM have been achieving with their latest generation of engines. For reference, even the shrunk-down versions of the Pratt & Whitney geared turbofan, used by the Embraer E2 family, has a bypass ratio of 9 to 1. And beyond just the straight statistics and efficiency numbers, there is also the question of how long these engines will be able to operate between each overhaul. And also how easy spare parts can be sourced for them after entering service. Russian engine manufacturers have quite a mixed reputation in that regard. Now, also having said all of that, fewer than 5 PD-8 engines have actually been delivered so far. And as for the Superjet itself, the third prototype of what Russia calls the fully domestic version just took flight earlier this year, and they are likely years away from full production. On top of that, many observers also doubt that all of this aircraft's avionics, hydraulics and other systems really are fully Russian. But of course, the Superjet isn't Russia's only hope of having a fully Russian airliner. There are at least 2 other such contenders as well, but when we're on the subject of the need for precision engineering, this actually exists in everyday objects too. And that's why I am so excited to introduce today's sponsor, Novium, and their fantastic hover pens. Sleek, beautifully engineered and perfect Father's Day gifts. The hover pen Interstellar, for example, is inspired by spacecraft design and made from aircraft-grade aluminium. It floats at a precise 23.5 degree angle, just like the Earth's axis, and it's held up by a permanent magnet, so no electricity needed. The Interstellar comes in 4 different colors, with a premium version containing a real meteorite shard embedded inside of the tip, likely older than the Earth itself. And if that's not cool enough for you, this pen actually won the Times Award as one of the best inventions of 2022. Now, if you're more into fountain pens, well then the hover pen Future might be more of your style. This one comes in 3 different colors with interchangeable tips and an even more dramatic 60-degree hover angle. Both hover pens are stylish, refillable and comfortable to use. They are great conversation starters and make for excellent gifts for space fans, pilots and anyone who appreciates precision really. Perfect for Father's Day and any occasion really. So to get your hands on one, then use this QR code or the link in the description below together with the code Mentour. That will give you a 15% discount for the next 48 hours and 10% after that, as well as free international shipping for most countries. Thank you, Novium. Now let's continue. So next, I want to focus on the Irkut MC21, which is now being made under the Yakolev brand. This was once heralded as Russia's most promising entry into the competitive narrow-body aircraft market, and for very good reasons. If the MC21 would have entered service the way it was originally conceived, it would have been a technological marvel. For example, it was the first airliner to feature active side-stick controls supplied by a French-based division of UTC Aerospace Systems, which is the same company that's making side sticks for Airbus, by the way. These side sticks provided pilots with tactile feedback, enhancing situational awareness and flight safety, something that I personally have been a strong supporter of. The aircraft also featured a carbon fiber reinforced polymer wing, contributing to improved aerodynamical and fuel efficiency, and the rest of the MC21's design further incorporated a significant amount of composite materials, accounting for about 40% of its structure, a record figure for medium-range aircraft, all supplied by international partners, including companies in Japan. But of course, when the MC21 was launched back in 2007, the geopolitical landscape looked completely different from the one that we see today. So, similar to the Superjet, the development of the MC21 had been a collaborative project with many Western aerospace giants participating. In an alternative timeline, where Russia didn't annex Crimea in 2014, the development of the MC21 could have been very different. Remember, this was a time when Boeing had actually opened a design bureau in Moscow in order to attract Russian engineers. If the connection between Russia's aviation industry and Western companies hadn't broken down, who knows where the MC-21 could have been today. When Airbus took over Bombardier's C-Series and turned it into the Airbus A220, maybe Boeing could have struck a deal to turn the MC-21 into the Boeing 797 in order to replace the 737 and maybe even the 757. Who knows? Now, if that scenario sounds a little bit crazy, remember that there was a time when Putin wanted Russia to join NATO, a scenario that was studied seriously both in Russia and in the West, so anything was possible back then. Anyway, such a partnership with the MC-21 could have combined Russian engineering prowess with Boeing's global reach, creating a formidable competitor in the narrow-body market. But the Crimea annexation in 2014, the COVID-19 pandemic and the war's escalation ended any such thoughts for good. The MC-21's reliance on foreign components now became a liability instead, forcing a rapid shift towards domestically produced alternatives, and here is where things become really interesting. This transition to domestic composite materials and construction methods caused a weight increase for the aircraft by as much as 6 tons. This in turn reduced the MC-21's range, with some reports indicating that at maximum payload it is now less than 1,500 nautical miles, and its service ceiling is only 23,000 feet. In practice, this means that the plane's max payload is now cut significantly, making it completely uncompetitive against its main Western rivals. Additionally, the unproven nature of these new Russian-made components have also raised concerns about the aircraft's reliability. The Aviad Vigatel PD-14 engine, which I mentioned earlier, was designed for the MC-21, but in addition to that really low 8.5 to 1 bypass ratio, it also produces 2,000 pounds less thrust than the PW1400G that it's meant to replace, which is another reason why the MC-21's payload, range and service ceiling have suffered so much from its Russification. All of this also meant the end of any hopes of international certification, which means no chances for exports and a plane doomed to only serve Aeroflot and other Russian airlines. Now, to cover the fleet shortfall that the Russian airlines are experiencing after the sanctions, the Russian government have also announced that they would restart production of the Tupolev Tu-214. And this is a jet essentially identical to the Tu-204, which is just made in a different factory. That's an early 1990s design that still includes a third crew member, a flight engineer, in the cockpit. The Tupolev Tu-214 is basically Russia's answer to Boeing 757, with few, if any, real updates since the first Tu-204 flew back in 1989. This means that it's heavy, fuel-hungry, and of course completely non-competitive. But at least it's Russian. But even that might not matter at all, because its production numbers are so incredibly low. Between 2012 and 2024, just 3 of them were actually made. That's 3 planes in 12 years. So all of this means that despite the difficulties that Russian airlines have in sourcing spare parts for their Western aircraft, they have basically no choice but to keep doing that, because Russian aircraft are lacking in performance, to put it mildly, and might not even be able to be produced at all. So that's Russia. Now let's talk about China. Unlike Russia, China's pursuit of aviation independence didn't start because of a sudden crisis. Instead, it started deliberately, years ago, with a long-term plan to challenge the Western giants of the sky, and China's self-sufficiency push is far more disciplined and well-organized than Russia's chaotic scramble. The centerpiece of that effort is the Comac C919, a narrow-body jet designed to compete head-to-head with Airbus's A320neo and the Boeing 737 MAX. Development of this jet officially began back in the mid-2000s, and from the very beginning the goal was very ambitious: to create a fully Chinese airliner that could really break into the global market. But for all of their efforts, like the Russian attempts, the C919 is still far from all Chinese. If you pop open one of the engine cowlings, for example, you'll find a CFM LEAP 1 Charlie engine, built through a joint venture between GE of the United States and France's Safran. And that's very similar to the LEAP engines powering many Airbus A320neos and Boeing 737 Maxes. In the C919's cockpit, you'll also find avionics from Honeywell, General Electric and Rockwell Collins, and even the landing gear relies on German-built components. According to industry analysts, as recently as this year, China still had parts for the C919 sourced from 46 different countries. And there's more. COMAC originally leaned heavily on these foreign suppliers for a specific reason. They needed to meet international certification standards like those used by the FAA and EASA. Without key components from established international suppliers, the C919 would have struggled to achieve even basic airworthiness and would therefore have little prospects of sales in any foreign markets. But from the outset, China has been making chess moves to domesticate its homemade aircraft, eventually. And the biggest move? Developing the CJ1000 Alpha engine, a fully Chinese-designed alternative to the LEAP 1 Charlie currently mounted on the C919. But that engine is still years away from entering service, and even when it does, optimistically sometimes in the late 2020s, it will face an uphill battle proving its reliability, efficiency and safety compared to its Western rivals who have just been in the game for so much longer. You see, the specific material science tricks, including ceramic matrix composites and gearboxes that jet manufacturers in the West have mastered over those decades, are some of the most closely guarded secrets in the aviation world. Turbine blades in a modern jet engine's hot section often operate in temperatures high enough to melt them. But they stay intact thanks to the internal cooling that's made possible by these secret manufacturing methods. So simply just examining and measuring these parts isn't enough if someone wants to try to reproduce them. These secret ingredients are the difference between making an engine that just works or one that works reliably with comparable efficiency to other modern engines and for thousands of hours between repairs. But China understands these difficulties, and unlike Russia, they aren't trying to replace everything overnight. They're instead playing a very long game. First, they build a plane using Western components, and then they bolster education, development and investment so that they can gradually swap in Chinese systems as they mature. That seems like a quite sensible plan, unless there is a radical technological change, like a switch over to hydrogen, for example, which obviously, if that would happen, wouldn't happen overnight. But even without a deal breaker like that, other hurdles would still remain. The C919 still lacks FAA or EASA certification, meaning it can't be sold outside of China and a few friendly countries that recognize Chinese aircraft certification. So without those global stamps of approval, the C919 will remain a mostly domestic product, limited in reach and reputation. But having said that, in late April of this year, 2025, EASA Executive Director Florian Guillemette announced that China and COMAC was on track to get this aircraft certified in 3 to 6 years. And remember, that's after COMAC and Europe's aviation regulators have already worked on this for 4 years. And it's not just the C919 that we're talking about either. The C909, or ARJ21 until recently, is China's regional jet that entered service back in 2016, and it has faced its own growing pains. That includes a very slow production rate, limited international interest, maintenance headaches, as well as questions about long-term support, which relies on supplies of spare parts, including for the same General Electric CF34 engines as the CRJ and legacy Embraer E-Series regional jets are using. So the lesson here seems clear. Even with massive investment, political will and patience, aviation independence is brutally hard and takes years to achieve. So even with every advantage, China is still years away from true aviation independence. And when they get there, they'll have to prove that they can certify, support and fly their aircraft safely for decades to come. And that's the real challenge here. So, what about the United States then? I'm sure many of you have worked this out by now, but the reason that I'm making this video is because when I previously made videos about tariffs, some viewers commented that Russia and China are shining examples of how a country can focus on its domestic industry if they are forced to, or if they just decide to do that themselves. And as I hope that I've now showed you, maybe they aren't as shining examples as some of you thought. But Boeing are headquartered in the US and assembled most of their planes in Washington State and South Carolina. Gulfstream builds business jets in Georgia. Cessna and Bombardier's Learjet divisions have deep roots in Kansas. So surely, if any country could build a 100% homegrown airliner, it would be the United States, right? Well, in a previous video, I spent some time discussing how the 787 is basically made around the world. And even if we concentrate on Boeing's most American-made aircraft, the 737 MAX, we see that it also relies on a vast network of foreign suppliers and parts. Landing gear components, Canada, wiring harnesses, Mexico, critical avionics systems, France and Sweden, wing panels, shipped in from Japan. So could Boeing really replace all of these foreign parts? Well, given the cost and the time this would take, the 737 would likely be out of production by then. So the short answer is no, Boeing can't do that. And it gets even worse. The skilled workforce needed to ramp up a fully domestic aerospace industry isn't readily available either. Boeing's recent labor strikes and the struggles to replace retiring workers highlighted how fragile the pipeline of trained aerospace technicians has become. Expanding this workforce would take years, maybe decades, and would definitely drive costs even higher. Labor in the American aviation sector is already a struggle, as Boeing's machinist strike showed last year. That took months to resolve, and Boeing has 5 more workforce contracts set to expire between now and October of 2026, including SPEEA, who represents the engineering side of the company. Just like we discussed in the video we made about modern trade movements affecting manufacturing, aviation today isn't just about who builds the plane, it's about how it's built. It needs to be done quickly, reliably and cost-effectively, using the best parts and the best talents from around the world. Trying to go at it alone would break that system and put anyone who tries it in a serious disadvantage in a global aviation race, unless they are really prepared to wait for a very long time, possibly decades. That's actually why Boeing grew their manufacturing beyond their home country in the first place, and of course they weren't alone in doing that. Airbus actually started out as an international project. They were a deliberate effort by several European nations to pool their resources, engineering talent and industrial capacity together to challenge the dominance of American manufacturers like Boeing and McDonnell Douglas. And it worked. Now, I know that isn't an entirely fair comparison, because in many industries, Europe and the European Union in particular work as a single country, simplistically speaking. And of course, Airbus also received plenty of support during their formative years, including launch aid and subsidies from countries like France, Germany, the UK and Spain. And while that support was challenged by the US and remains a point of contention for Boeing, it gave Airbus some breathing room early on in order to build a credible alternative to the American jet makers. Now, even today, Airbus is structured across national lines with design and engineering centers in France, Germany, Spain and the UK. Their final assembly lines also span the globe, from Toulouse and Hamburg to Tianjin in China to Mobile, Alabama. Their suppliers come from over 180 countries, delivering everything from fasteners and actuators to major systems and composite components. But the point here is that Airbus isn't unique in this. Boeing built their own global supplier network for the very same reasons that Airbus did. So what lessons can we learn from all of this then? Well, I think that the global aviation industry has spent literally decades evolving the way it has. And even though some mistakes have been made and will continue to be made, we've now come up with ways to operate cooperatively, efficiently and safely. Walking back to strictly national industries might seem attractive in some respects, but we must be honest when we talk about the consequences that this will have, both in terms of the time needed for such a change and the effects that the loss of international talent will bring, as well as negative economical and safety impacts. In my view, the future of flight depends on building bridges, not walls. But of course, what I am seeing right now can be compared to watching a group of really smart people deciding to, instead of working together and fully utilize everyone's strength, they will go at it individually to try and solve all problems by themselves. It's just very, very strange. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below, and if you want to see my next video before anyone else, maybe even today, then use your phone camera and scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. Also, remember to click the link below for your exclusive deal with my sponsor. I only take sponsors that I use myself and who I think will benefit you, so please check them out. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.